Hello there. This is Ralph Schultz from Albuquerque, New Mexico, United States of America. Hello, everybody. And this is Wednesday, July 6th, I believe. So I just have a 10-minute discussion here about the current situation in Ukraine. Most of you know that I've written a book, and a lot of actually what's transpired is implied in that working dialogue, as I call it. So I thought about the big picture. Did I really have anything to say here to my audience? And I'm a big picture kind of person. And I looked at all kinds of internet news stories. They're not conspiracy theories. They're TV from news from public television in Germany, India, Africa, CNN, different news sources, Duran, John Mearsheimer, and many more. Whatever is relevant, Sky News, it goes on. What I see is a dangerous and increased escalation of the risk level in this war due to continuing policies by NATO and the USA, because the USA is usually the leader, despite the so-called NATO, that are threatening to Russia and putting the squeeze on to do everything possible to stop Russian advances in the Ukraine. And Russia is slowly advancing and doing a lot of damage to the Ukrainian army and the infrastructure in the cities. And they're losing many troops too. But they seem to have the will or the capacity to bring in more, which is a Russian characteristic. They have huge artillery advantage. It's an artillery war, and secondarily tanks, then infantry. By artillery, I also mean missiles. So what I'm concerned about is we'll call it a limited nuclear war in Eastern Europe. How it spreads, how good damage it does, I'm not sure. But tactical nuclear weapons can range from a tiny one that might blow up part of a football stadium or baseball stadium in the US to one that's 10% or 20% the size of the Hiroshima bomb, and that wiped out a city of how many? Thousands, tens of thousands. 10 miles in diameter, and so it can be very destructive to small cities or military installations and forts and so on, bases. And it's nothing to think it's just a minor battlefield type of weapon. And 15 kilotons was the size of the Hiroshima bomb. The current ones in use by the USA and Russia range from 100 to 300 or 400 kilotons. Can you imagine 10 to 20 times the size of Hiroshima? That's the full-size babies, and the ones that are prepared to go today as we sit here. All right, so I'm concerned this is leading to a stalemate war where Russia might feel they're losing and resort to nuclear weapons, which is in their national defense plan if they feel threatened, the homeland. And if they're losing Ukraine, they will feel threatened. It's called an existential threat to existence. So what do we need to ask ourselves is will Russia be satisfied with what it more or less has, creating another Novaya Russia, New Russia? And this crescent-shaped thing includes the Donbass, some area near up towards Kharkov, in around the Black and Azov Sea to Kyrgyzstan, not to Odessa. That might be part of what the objective, but if it just more or less expands slightly from what it is, will Ukraine allow this? They said they won't give an inch. They keep flipping flopping, but a lot of European countries now, in different places and news even, are discussing maybe it's time for Ukraine to just call it and say, what do we need to give? They're going to have to give up some territory. They would have given up a lot less at the beginning. Then you have to ask yourself, they'll probably, if there is some sort of truce, it'll probably be just not a real peace treaty, so to speak, but an armistice with a line of demarcation, more or less somewhat like it is with the southern part of Novaya Russia under Russian control, with constant skirmishes. Oh boy. So, and then will the UK, Ukraine, still be under the influence of Western military operations and planning? Because a lot of the country would still be right tucked up against the Russian border in Belarus, enough to cause it to be a threat if it wanted to, and NATO installed more weapons. There's already enough in there as it is, and they've been put into Eastern Europe to be a threat. So I thought I'd read you some tweets I did last week quickly, and then I'm going to read you about a dozen escalating policies. Okay? And I have to read that from my phone. I was replying to Andrei Yermak's tweet, which basically said, he's the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, that Russia was a threat to the world and Europe, which I think is nonsense. Okay, it's just interested in its perimeter in certain key countries there. And Ukraine became a threat, a bulwark of NATO probing further east, with NATO and US backing for several years. So what I say is, you are making Russia a world threat, so Europe will assist you unequivocally. They are not a threat to Europe. Your inflammatory speeches are, though. They're whipping things up. Another writer, Nick Schifrin, said in his tweet, POTUS, President Biden announces new U.S. military deployments in Europe, not in Ukraine, but as defense against Russia aggression, which is not going to happen against any major European country. Create permanent headquarters for U.S. Fifth Army Corps in Poland. Deploy additional rotational brigade to Romania. Deploy additional 2 F-35 squadrons to the United Kingdom, England, and enhance rotational deployments in the Baltics. And what I said, this is just provocative and unnecessary. Russia isn't invading Europe. Makes my blood boil that all you so-called intellectuals are cheerleading us into a major war. I was in Fifth Army, U.S. How about you hotshot pundits? Rank in MOS, please. MOS is military occupational specialty. Because none of these people, or hardly any, were in the military. And they throw around words and ideas as if they know what they're talking about with the military. They don't know what it's like to fire deadly weapons, M16, like I did. I wasn't in combat. I stayed in the U.S. in the reserves, but I had to train in my platoon in basic training. 50 of us, 25 were college grads going back to their home big cities to be in the reserves to write political science papers for the United States Department of Defense about Russia and China and the Middle East. Even then, 1971. And the other 25 were young kids, 17 to 19-year-olds, mostly draftees, some volunteers, gung-ho. This is Vietnam War, still pretty hot in 1971. They all went to Vietnam in combat arms, infantry, artillery, and so on, engineers. And I'm sure some of them that I knew and liked are dead or have been maimed for life. It's terrible. I was so happy I didn't have to go. Can't tell you how relieved I was and still am. Okay, so a little cynicism there. Another argument I made, this is about what somebody said about Boris Johnson in England, about Ukraine and sending more weapons, and the fact that he said something outlandish, and I said, this is absolutely foolish, ignorant speech that will inflame people to war. Another thing I responded to, what I said is it's plain arrogance and a refusal to believe an autocratic state can be successful and not subordinate to the USA. All countries that are Caucasian are subordinate to the USA, practically all, except Belarus and Russia. And think about that. China, India, they are more or less on Russia's side. And a lot of the African nations are skeptical of this Ukraine war and NATO's advances east. They much more see a peace as necessary where Ukraine gives up a chunk of its territory to Russia. And then I mentioned about my stepfather in response to some general saying something. My stepfather, Colonel Chubaty, C-H-U-B-A-T-Y, that's a Ukrainian name, was G2, a Fifth Army active reserve in the 1970s. That's head of all Army, reserve intelligence in 8 Midwestern states. It's a big position. Fifth Army, I don't know what it had, 100,000 troops in it, reserves. I was in the Fifth Army. He was Ukrainian, first generation American. His parents migrated to USA in the 1920s. That's my step-grandparents. I knew them. They spoke with an accent. My step-grandmother looked like she was a Russian or Ukrainian peasant, the way she dressed and acted. Very nice woman, but they, had a certain stereotypical characteristics. And a lot of Ukraine was just an agricultural state or industrial. So the proletariat and the farmers. Russia was more sophisticated in a lot of ways overall, at least in the eastern big cities, except for Kiev. And I think you should listen to retired Colonel McGregor about the fallacy of U.S. policy at the Ukraine. Douglas McGregor, M-A-C-G-R-E-O-R. He's been on Fox, I believe, and he's on has his own videos. You get a different, and it's a logical viewpoint, which basically is Ukraine is going to have to recognize Russia is going to get a piece of southern Ukraine based on the history and just the reality of the situation, because Russia's not going to stop otherwise. Okay, there we go. Now I'm moving on a little bit more. Hang with me. Here's some of the escalations that have occurred from the NATO in the West. Russia obviously started this thing physically. They attacked. They had their reasons for it. And NATO and the USA helped provoke them for 10 years. Were insensitive to their concerns. But in any event, now, there's been the sanctions, obviously. Here's some more recent things. Just going to read these down. Lithuania blocking Russian access by rail to Kaliningrad, I don't know how you say it. The Russian small country on the Baltic Sea. Substantial amount of their 50% of their rail traffic stopped. Excuse me. Where you go? more weapons from the U.S. and other countries, particularly the U.S., putting $5 billion in. That's a lot of weapons. But the ones that are really helping and tend to help are these javelins, these over-the-shoulder anti-tank weapons. They've really knocked out a lot of Russian tanks. And now we've changed our mind to putting in more aggressive missiles. The HIMARS, which is the high mobility mobile artillery rocket system, and they're very effective, very accurate, medium range. That's what, 30 to 70 miles. They could probably reach Russia. They're not supposed to. And this new howitzer, it's an M777, which is very scientific, and high tech, capable of reaching the current Russian artillery and more. And that may, if there's 150, Russia has knocked out a few. I'm guessing 10 or 15. But if enough of them are present in a particular concentrated area, they may stop the Russian artillery, and turn it in their lines into chaos, and make the Russian artillery much less effective. Now that could lead to Russia retreating, getting nervous, and if they do that, we're into the area of Ukraine, occupation of Ukraine close to the Russian border, being considered an existential threat to the homeland, where they said they will or could use nuclear weapons. NATO, Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Comments by high-ranking officers in the United Kingdom and Germany that about using the Air Force and soldiers, British soldiers, to fight Russia in the Ukraine, or the German Air Force, which is small, easy to say. Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, canceling it or stopping it temporarily, maybe, for the Russian gas to run more efficiently. An oil price, what I call limitation, price ceiling. U.S. and Europe is going to try to say to Russia, we'll only pay about 50% of the current market price. Well, that won't work, because there'll be a black market and the oil will get sold and distributed eventually. But it's a threat. I mean, if some effect. Then, along with the oil, now the new thing where the U.S. and the United Kingdom, where Lloyd's of London is, that insures most of the world's shipping, won't insure Russian oil tankers. Well, unless Russia figures out a way to insure it, and they may be able to, they won't be allowed to dock anywhere. They won't be able to deliver oil. Okay? And some of that oil is going on Greek ships, which is controversial now. For now it's being allowed, but it's another major threat. Zelensky is constantly saying we want to take back all of Ukraine, and he said it today, which is not only preposterous. That would be the type of threat that would set off Russia to do something extremely drastic. They aren't going to just capitulate, and don't think Putin's going to just leave. It's not that easy. So Russia can't lose. U.S. weapons, ironically, are more likely to cause Russia to lose, or certainly slow them down. The Javelin is very effective, and these new missile and artillery systems can reach the Russian artillery. Ukraine can't reach it now. And if that happens, it's going to put a stop, perhaps, to Russian advances. They have to get going now. And they are, as a matter of fact. And there's been more talk from other European countries and some of the African countries to come on. It's time for Ukraine is going to have to give up some territory to have some sort of settlement that stops combat. And Biden said we're not going to stop the Ukraine wins, and he is an idealist, like a lot of people in Washington and in the West Coast, which can be harmful. You won't give in. You're too committed to an idea which may not be totally practical. What's practical is to realize Russia, whether you like it or not, feels they have an interest in Ukraine and needs it as a bulwark against NATO aggression in their own mind. I think they do. If Ukraine hadn't embraced the U.S. and the U.S. hadn't pushed Ukraine so hard to become part of NATO and encourage the Ukrainian nationalists, some are called Nazis, but I'll call them extreme nationalists, they're really running the country, and they don't want to budge an inch. And that's one of the line of thinking is one of the things Russia wants to get out of that country. Very complicated. So, there it is. It's not a real good picture. Peskov, the press agent for secretary for Putin, said today, Russia, with their army, they're going to protect the sovereignty of Luhansk and Donetsk, the Donbass, because now they recognize them as separate quasi-countries. Now they feel justified in defending them. That's going to make it impossible for them to give any of that up, and I know they won't. So there we go. Maybe it'll bog down and there will be a pause armistice where the Ukraine allows Russia to hold on to its current territory, all of the Donbass and those southern oblast states running along the Azov and Black Sea, but not reaching Odessa. That won't resolve the conflict, but maybe if we can just stop this temporarily, it will stop things from just getting worse, and they're just getting worse and worse. And I think the U.S. and some European countries are concerned that Ukraine may collapse, and it might. It's hard to say. And like I said before, the U.S. is fighting Russia. Period. Proxy war, call it what you want. It's U.S. attacking or countering Russia, fighting a war with their weapons, mostly their weapons. They're the best ones. Supporting an army called the Ukrainian Army, which is really the substitute for the U.S. Army, because we're not going to have our own troops in there getting killed. We're starting a major war with Russia, but we're fighting Russia, and we're using the Ukrainian Army as our you call them our mercenaries, substitutes for the U.S. military ground forces and Air Force. That's how I see it. We're behind the scenes. We say Ukraine can do whatever they want, but we don't want them to so-called lose or give up too much territory to Russia. So there you go. The best to all of you. It's July. The weather's warm. And I'll be talking to you maybe in August if there is something really relevant to discuss. Okay, everybody? Have a good day.